Велике значення для України на міжнародній арені мав візит прем'єр-міністра Канади Стівена Гарпера до Києва 2 тижні тому, якраз перед початком нарад Великої Сімки в Німеччині. Сьогодні в розмові з нами сам прем'єр-міністр пояснить ціль і висліди цієї подорожі в Україну.
Дорогі глядачі, вітаємо вас на українській телемережі «Контакт». І сьогодні маємо приємність мати розмову з прем'єр-міністром Канади, паном Стівен Harper. Prime Minister, thank you very much for appearing on our show.
Well, thanks for giving me the chance, Jurij.
We saw your press conference on our show, the one that you did with President Poroshenko in Kyiv, and it would be very interesting to hear what was the message that you brought to the G7, having been in Ukraine just the day before.
Well, look, the message, we are obviously in Ukraine to convey our strong and ongoing support for the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine. And I was able to go to the G7 and tell people firsthand what I'd learned from President Poroshenko, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. Look, one of the things I said was the following. We know that Mr. Putin's aggression and occupation has done some real damage. But at the same time, what I said I saw was Ukrainian leaders, for the first time, really since the fall of the Soviet Union, determined to enact reform, working together, and with the country largely behind them. And, you know, outside of those occupied areas, the country is now remarkably united compared to, you know, terrible factionalism we've had in the past. So, in a sense, I think in the long term, if you look at Mr. Putin's real aim, as we all understand, is to incorporate Ukraine into a greater Russian nation. Yes. He's probably at no time has he made Russia and the concept of being part of Russia less popular or less feasible than it is today. So, look, I encourage our leaders to, other leaders to remain optimistic, remain determined. The leaders, as you know, G7 leaders issued a statement saying we're committed to the sanctions. They've been broad, and we are committed to increasing them if necessary. And I just encourage them all, and I think they're all agreed, that this is a long-term fight. Mr. Putin, you know, it's very clear now what he's been doing for 15 years, trying to recreate the dream of his dream, I suppose, of a new Soviet empire. Very clear where he's trying to go. It's also clear that in the long term he's really damaging his country. So I think if we stay united, keep the pressure on, never accept the occupation of or annexation of Ukrainian territory, we will win this over time. The Russian people will eventually turn against him because of the damage he is doing to their economy and to their relations with the world.
You've mentioned sanctions. To what extent do you think they have worked, or to what extent have they corralled Mr. Putin? And what kind of further sanctions could there be?
Right. Look, I know some people say, well, the sanctions haven't worked because, you know, I guess he hasn't left Ukraine. But in fact, his advance has really come to almost a standstill. We know for a fact the damage to the Russian economy through the sanctions has been significant. I mean, you can see that in the numbers. It particularly affects some of the Russian elites. But look, as I said, the sanctions and the whole program of isolation, to be effective, have to be applied over a long time. This is not something that's going to, Mr. Putin didn't imagine this overnight, and it's not something that's going to be reversed overnight. But I think, as I say, if we keep up the pressure on Russia, the fact is Mr. Putin is ruining the economy. He has no real economic policy. He's not building institutions. He's not appealing to the real desire of younger Russians to be a free and democratic Western nation. And so I believe that if we can stay the course, that long-term, I believe, as I said in my press conference, one of my press conferences in Europe, I believe that Mr. Putin I believe that Russia's long-term security interests are very similar to the Western world, both the opportunities they have and the threats we share. And I think Mr. Putin is a throwback, kind of the last gasp of a bygone era, and I eventually think that era will pass in its entirety, and so will Mr. Putin.
Well, there was some talk after the G7 about NATO increasing some kind of military support for Ukraine or its stand against Putin.
Well, I think we should be clear on two things that are happening, and we're participants in both. One of them is NATO's reassurance measures to Eastern Europe, to NATO allies in Eastern Europe, and Canada is participating in that. We're providing Army troops that have been training in Poland. We've had Air Force in Romania and the Baltic states. We have naval. We have a vessel. Obviously, I was on that vessel in the Baltic Sea.
They're trying to scare you there.
Tracked by Mr. Putin's frigates. We've been in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean. So we've had Army, Navy, Air Force there, and so have many other countries to reassure, particularly Poland, the Baltic states in particular, that feel threatened by Russia's kind of relentless aggressive talk and courting of minorities through propaganda. So that's very important. In terms of Ukraine directly, as you know, Ukraine is not a NATO country, so NATO is not helping Ukraine directly, although NATO has morally given very strong and unanimous support to the Ukrainian position. But individual allies are helping Ukraine. Obviously, we are providing a whole range of non-lethal aid. I think we're actually providing the widest range of non-lethal aid in the world, but we're now working with the Americans, the British are also there, and others. There's individual allies who are also providing military training and other assistance to Ukrainian forces, and that will continue.
Now, what about a little bit of a Canadian angle? Is there in the back of like the Canadian mind or Canadian government, right now we're sort of facing Putin through Ukraine. Is there a potential threat of having to face Putin up in the north to protect whatever our interests are up north?
Well, look, one of the reasons we take this so seriously is we know from history that militaristic and aggressive regimes don't just pick on one person. They are a threat to everybody. I was amused, as you know, Mr. Putin decried Canada's support for Ukraine, saying,
yes,
well, we're so far away.
Where are you? Yeah.
Well, we're also a neighbor of Russia over the North Pole. So if Russia is going to start invading neighbors, and we know Russian bombers and Russian aircraft are constantly testing Canadian airspace, and under Mr. Putin this has been rising exponentially, we know that we have to be on guard in our Arctic with our allies, and we are. Obviously, it goes just beyond the neighbor relationship, though, as well, as you know, because of the strength of our Ukrainian community and the fact that we as Canadians all know Ukrainians. I think we just have, it's our own belief as a nation that we have always wanted to see the Ukrainian people be free and prosperous and independent. And so that is the position we're going to take, and it's the right position. It's the right position for the world. And we're not going to back off it. You know, I was saying, I've said many times, Soviet Union seized the Baltic states in 1939. We as Western countries never recognized that occupation. And the moment the Soviets dropped their guard, 50 years later, those became independent countries again. We need to take the same view of all occupied Ukrainian territory. We will never accept its annexation or occupation by Russia, and the moment we have a chance, it will become sovereign Ukrainian territory again.
Well, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.